She found the box behind the old tax records. Inside, a photograph, a name she'd never heard, and a child who looked exactly like her husband. For 41 years, Eleanor thought she knew the man sleeping beside her. She thought the private silences were grief. She thought the locked drawer held old bills. She was wrong. The man she buried was not the man she married. He had another name, another family, another life, running silently beneath her own for 4 decades. And now, with nothing left to lose and everything to understand, Eleanor Hayes had one question. Who was she, if he was never real? The week Richard died, Chicago couldn't decide what season it wanted to be. It was the 3rd week of October, and the city kept swinging between stubborn warmth and sudden cold, as if nature itself was uncertain, hesitant, the way Eleanor felt every morning when she woke up and reached across the bed to his side, still expecting to find him there. The sheets had long lost his warmth, but her hand never stopped looking. Eleanor Hayes was 70 years old, and she had been a widow for 31 days. She stood at the kitchen window of their home on North Paulina Street, the house they had bought together in 1991, when Diane was 13, and the neighborhood still smelled like bakery bread on Sunday mornings. The oak tree in the backyard had gone entirely red, and the leaves were falling in slow, indifferent spirals. She watched them without really seeing them, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold between her hands. Richard had planted that tree. He'd done it on a rainy Saturday in April of 1993, with a shovel too big for the hole he'd dug, and a stubbornness that made her laugh until her sides ached. "It'll be here long after both of us are gone," he had said, patting the soil around the roots with the careful reverence of a man burying something sacred. She had believed him. She had believed everything he ever said. That was the thing about Eleanor Hayes. She had always been a woman who believed. She believed in the goodness of people. She believed in the slow, steady architecture of a life built together. She had taught 4th grade at Eugene Field Elementary for 32 years, and she had brought that same patient faith to her classroom that she brought to her marriage. The deep, abiding conviction that with enough time and enough care, things would grow into what they were meant to be. She and Richard had met in the spring of 1982 at a church fundraiser in Lincoln Square. He was 40 years old, handsome in a quiet way, with gray already threading through his dark hair, and a stillness about him that she had mistaken for depth. He had handed her a paper cup of lemonade and said, "I hear you're a teacher. I've always thought teachers were the bravest people in the world." She had laughed. 6 months later, they were engaged. They had 41 years together. 41 years of dinners and arguments and reconciliations, of holidays and hospital visits, and the slow accumulation of furniture, of photographs, of private jokes that no one else in the world would understand. Diane had grown up in this house, had left for college, had come back with a husband and 2 children of her own. Richard had walked her down the aisle. He had held his grandchildren in the backyard under that same oak tree. He had been, Eleanor was certain, a good man. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass and closed her eyes. The call came at 11:17 that morning. She almost didn't answer. She had been screening calls since the funeral, letting voicemails pile up like unread condolence cards. But something made her pick up. Perhaps it was the unfamiliar number. Perhaps it was simply the need to hear a voice that wasn't Diane asking if she'd eaten, or her friend Patricia calling for the 3rd time that week. "Mrs. Hayes?" The voice was professional, measured, a man in his 40s, she guessed, the kind of voice that lived behind a mahogany desk. "My name is Graham Aldrich. I'm an estate attorney in Milwaukee. I apologize for contacting you directly, but I've been trying to reach you for several days. I believe we have a matter to discuss that concerns your late husband." Eleanor set down her tea. "Richard passed away last month," she said. "If this is about outstanding debts or—" "It isn't about debts, Mrs. Hayes." A pause. Brief, but weighted. "It concerns another estate, a matter that predates your marriage. I'm afraid it's somewhat delicate, and I think it would be better discussed in person. Would you be willing to come to Milwaukee, or I can arrange to meet you in Chicago at your convenience?" She stood very still. "What kind of matter?" she asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Mrs. Hayes, are you aware that your husband was previously known by another name?" The oak tree outside shook in the wind. A fistful of red leaves tore free and scattered. Eleanor's hand tightened around the phone. "I'm sorry," she said slowly. "Could you repeat that?" But she had heard him perfectly. and somewhere in the basement of her chest, in a place she had never needed to visit before, something very old and very quiet shifted. She didn't tell Diane, not yet. She called Patricia instead, Pat Nguyen, her best friend of 22 years, a retired nurse with a sharp tongue and an even sharper instinct for when something was wrong. Pat drove over within the hour, let herself in with the spare key Eleanor had given her years ago, and found Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table with the phone still in her hand and the tea stone cold beside her. "What happened?" Pat asked, setting down her coat. Eleanor looked up. Her face was composed. She had always been composed, even in the worst moments. But her eyes were doing something complicated. "I think," she said carefully, "that I may not have known my husband as well as I thought." Pat sat down. She reached across the table and covered Eleanor's hand with her own. "Tell me," she said. Eleanor told her. Outside, the wind picked up. Chicago shook the last warmth from its bones and finally surrendered to the cold. Graham Aldrich drove to Chicago. He arrived on a Thursday, a careful-looking man with silver-rimmed glasses and the practiced sympathy of someone who had delivered difficult news many times before. Eleanor met him in the living room, seated across from him in the armchair Richard used to call the thinking chair, while Pat sat nearby, watching with quiet intensity. The attorney opened his briefcase with the deliberate care of a man diffusing something. "I want to begin by saying that I understand this is an extraordinarily difficult time," he said, "and I would not be here if the circumstances were not, legally and personally, significant." "Please," Eleanor said, "just tell me." He nodded. He pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the coffee table, but did not yet open it. "The man you knew as Richard Allen Hayes," he began, "was born Thomas Edward Callahan on March 14, 1942 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He legally changed his name to Richard Allen Hayes in 1981, 1 year before you met him." The living room was very quiet. The radiator ticked. Somewhere on the street, a car horn sounded and faded. "Thomas Callahan," Eleanor repeated. The name felt foreign on her tongue, like a word from a language she had never studied. Why would he change his name? Aldrich opened the folder. He slid a document across the coffee table, a certified copy of a name change petition, filed in Milwaukee County in November of 1981. Eleanor looked at it without touching it. The signature at the bottom read, "Thomas Edward Callahan," and beneath it, stamped in bureaucratic blue ink, the new name, Richard Allen Hayes. "Mr. Callahan, your husband, was previously married," Aldrich said. "His first wife was a woman named Margaret Ann Briggs. They married in 1968. They had a son, Daniel Thomas Callahan, born in 1974. Pat made a small sound. Eleanor didn't. "He left them in 1980, Aldrich continued. "Daniel would have been 6 years old. Margaret received no further contact from her husband after his departure. She raised Daniel alone." Eleanor's hands were folded in her lap. She looked at them, the hands that had graded thousands of papers, that had held Richard's hand in the hospital, that had smoothed the hair back from Diane's forehead when she had nightmares as a child. She looked at them as if they belonged to someone else. "Does Margaret know?" she asked. "That he died?" "Yes. Daniel contacted my office after seeing the obituary in the Tribune online. Your husband, Mr. Callahan, apparently never entirely severed his connection to Milwaukee. Daniel had been searching for his father, on and off, for many years." "And the estate matter?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. Aldrich hesitated. "Before his death, your husband amended his will. He left a sum of money, a significant sum, to Daniel Callahan. He had maintained a separate account for many years, apparently for this purpose. I was named executor of that specific bequest. That is why I needed to contact you, for legal clarity regarding the estate, and because I felt you had a right to know." Eleanor nodded once, slowly. "How much?" she asked. $112,000. Pat exhaled sharply beside her. Eleanor simply continued to nod, as if the number were a piece of information she was filing away for later, in a drawer she would not open until she was ready. After Aldrich left, Eleanor sat in the thinking chair for a long time without moving. The afternoon light shifted across the room, from gold to gray. At some point, Pat brought her a glass of water and sat on the arm of the sofa and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. "He had a son," Eleanor said eventually. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant, as if it were coming from another room. Richard had a son, a real son. Somewhere out there is a man in his 40s who has Richard's blood and has spent his whole life not knowing where his father went. Yes, said Pat. And Richard knew. He knew all along. Yes. Eleanor picked up the glass of water. She held it without drinking. He looked at Diane walking down the aisle, she said, and he cried. I thought it was happiness. I thought he was crying because he was happy. She set the glass down. What was he really feeling, Pat? What was going through his mind? Pat had no answer for that. No one did. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and replayed 41 years like a film she had seen 100 times, watching now for the cuts, the edits, the scenes that had been quietly removed. She thought about the way Richard flinched slightly whenever Milwaukee came up in conversation. She had always assumed it was simply a place he had no fondness for, some vague, unhappy memory from youth. She thought about how he had always been vague about his family, how both his parents had died before she met him, how he had no siblings that he ever mentioned, how he deflected questions about his childhood with a kind of gentle, practiced ease that she had read as private grief. She had respected that privacy. She had loved him enough to give him space. Now she understood that the space she had given him was the space he needed to maintain a lie. In the morning, she called Graham Aldrich. I'd like to contact Daniel, she said, and Margaret, if they're willing. There was a brief pause on the line. I anticipated you might, Aldrich said. I'll reach out to Daniel on your behalf. While she waited to hear from Daniel Callahan, Eleanor went into the basement. It was something she had been avoiding since Richard's death. The basement, with its shelving units and plastic tubs and filing cabinets, the archaeological site of a 41-year marriage. Diane had offered to help sort through it, and Eleanor had said, soon, not yet, and meant it. But that morning she pulled on an old cardigan and went down alone, because this was something she needed to do without witnesses. The basement of the house on North Paulina Street smelled like old paper and cedar. Richard had been organized. He always was, with a methodical tidiness that Eleanor had found endearing, had teased him about gently. Everything was labeled. Everything had its place. She worked through the obvious things first: tax records, appliance warranties, insurance documents. She had been through some of these already with the estate lawyer, but now she went deeper, slower, looking with different eyes. She was looking for Thomas Callahan. She found him in a locked metal box at the back of the second shelf. The key was on Richard's keyring. She had always assumed it opened something mundane, a storage unit or a safety deposit box she'd forgotten about. She tried it on impulse, and the lock turned, and the lid opened. Inside, a photograph, a birth certificate, and 3 envelopes. The photograph was black and white, slightly faded, the edges soft with age. It showed a young man, 20-something, dark-haired, laughing, standing with a woman and a small child in front of a house Eleanor didn't recognize. The woman was pretty in a practical way, dark-eyed, her hair cut short. The child, a boy of perhaps 3 or 4, was reaching up to tug at the young man's sleeve, his face caught mid-laugh. Eleanor turned the photograph over. Written in a handwriting she didn't recognize, a woman's hand, she thought, neat and deliberate, were 4 words: Tom, Danny, and me. She sat down on the cold cement floor. She looked at the young man's face for a long time. The jaw, the way the eyes crinkled at the corners, the particular set of the shoulders. Yes, she could see it. Under the youth and the unfamiliar context, under the name she had never known, she could see Richard's face. She opened the birth certificate. Daniel Thomas Callahan. Born April 3rd, 1974. Father, Thomas Edward Callahan. Mother, Margaret Ann Callahan, née Briggs. She opened the first envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten on lined paper, dated June 1980. The handwriting was Richard's, unmistakably Richard's, but signed Tom. Margaret, I know there is nothing I can say. I know you will not forgive me, and I am not asking you to. I am asking only that you keep Danny safe, and that you tell him, when he is old enough, that his father was a coward who did a cowardly thing for reasons that felt, at the time, unavoidable. I am leaving money in the account we discussed. There will be more when I can. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Tom. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she opened the second envelope. This one was different. Not a letter, but a document. several pages, photocopied from what appeared to be a legal deposition. She scanned it, her reading glasses low on her nose, and slowly the shape of something emerged. Names she didn't recognize, dates from the late 1970s, references to a company called Meridian Freight Solutions, references to financial irregularities, to cooperation with federal investigators. She sat with the document for a long time, piecing it together. Richard, Thomas, had worked for a Milwaukee-based shipping company in the 1970s. The document suggested he had been a mid-level manager who had discovered that the company was being used as a front for a significant financial fraud scheme, pension fund theft, the kind that devastated ordinary working families. He had gone to federal investigators. He had cooperated. He had testified. And then he had disappeared. Eleanor set the document down and pressed her palms flat against her thighs. The third envelope was unsealed. Inside was a single index card, in Richard's handwriting, undated. For Eleanor, if you ever find this, I loved you truly. That part was never a lie. But the rest, I am sorry. I was afraid. And then I was ashamed. And then too much time had passed. The cowardice of good intentions is still cowardice. You deserved better. So did they. Our Eleanor stayed on the basement floor for a very long time. When she finally came upstairs, Pat was at the front door. She had a key. She had let herself in. She had known somehow that today would be a hard day. She took one look at Eleanor's face and said nothing. She just opened her arms. Eleanor walked into them and stood there. She did not cry. Not yet. He left a note, she said, her voice muffled against Pat's shoulder. He knew I'd find it eventually. He wanted me to understand. Did it help? Pat asked. Eleanor pulled back. She looked at her friend, this woman who had known her for 22 years, who had held her hand through Richard's cancer diagnosis, and through remission, and through the slow decline of the last 3 years, who had never once pretended that loving someone was simple. I don't know yet, Eleanor said. Daniel Callahan was 49 years old and drove a 2-year-old Subaru. He had his father's jaw, his father's way of holding his shoulders, and his father's eyes, though Eleanor had not expected to notice that, had not prepared herself for it, and it caught her like a hand pressed suddenly to the chest. They met at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue on a Saturday in early November. Eleanor had chosen a public place deliberately, neutral ground, the kind of place where difficult conversations could be had at a reasonable volume without anyone completely falling apart. It was a Saturday afternoon, busy but not overwhelming, and the November rain against the windows gave everything a gray, confessional quality. Daniel arrived 7 minutes late and apologized twice before sitting down. He was a solidly built man, not handsome in the conventional sense, but with a quiet intensity about him that was, Eleanor thought with a pang, very familiar. He was a high school history teacher in Kenosha. He had a wife named Carol and 2 teenage daughters. He had spent most of his adult life, he told her quietly, wondering what had happened to his father. My mother told me he left when I was 6, he said. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. She didn't say much more than that for a long time. I think she was protecting me. And then, I think, she just didn't want to talk about it. Is your mother well? Eleanor asked. She is. She's 71. She lives in Brookfield now, outside Milwaukee. She remarried when I was 12. A good man, Ted. He passed about 8 years ago. A pause. She was willing to meet with you, if you want. She said she'd always wondered about the woman he ended up with. Eleanor absorbed this carefully. What does she know? Eleanor asked. About why he left. Daniel shifted in his chair. His expression was complicated. The expression of a man who had spent decades making peace with something, and was now being asked to unpack it again. She knew about the federal investigation, he said. She found out years later, when some of it became public record. One of the men he testified against, a senior executive named Harlan Briggs, no relation to my mother, ended up going to prison in 1983. The case was documented. My mother's sister found an article in 1989 and sent it to her. Eleanor nodded slowly. The document I found in the basement mentioned a company, Meridian Freight. Yes. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. My father worked for Meridian from 1971 to 1979. Based on what the article said, he discovered that the senior leadership was systematically looting the company's employee pension fund. We're talking about hundreds of families, dock workers, drivers, warehouse staff. People who had worked their whole lives and were about to lose everything. He went to the authorities, Eleanor said. He went to the FBI. In late 1979, he cooperated fully, testified before a grand jury, provided documentation, the whole thing. Daniel's voice was careful, measured. The men he testified against were well-connected, locally powerful. There were threats, real ones. Eleanor set down her cup. He was afraid. He was afraid, Daniel agreed, and his solution to being afraid was to disappear, to leave my mother, to leave me, and to become someone else. He looked up at her directly. I've had a long time to decide how I feel about that. And where I've landed is, I understand it and I don't forgive it, and both of those things are true at the same time. Eleanor found herself nodding. There was something clarifying about his honesty, something almost physical. The way a window, opened suddenly, changes the quality of the air in a room. He left money, she said. He'd been saving for years. He wanted... I know, Daniel said, and his voice was rougher now. About the money. The attorney told me. And I'll tell you what I told the attorney. I don't want it for myself. My mother deserves part of it. She raised me alone. Whatever his reasons were, that's the reality she lived with. I agree, Eleanor said immediately. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and she could see him recalibrating something, adjusting whatever image of her he had constructed before this meeting. What was he like? He asked. As a husband. Eleanor considered the question with the full weight it deserved. He was patient, she said. He was funny, quietly, the kind of funny where you'd be halfway through dinner before you realized the joke. He was present. He came to every school play, every recital, every tedious parent meeting. When our daughter was sick, he slept in the chair by her bed for 3 nights and never complained. She paused. He was private. I always knew there was something he kept enclosed. I thought it was grief. I thought he'd had losses he couldn't talk about. I gave him that privacy because I loved him. She looked down at her hands. I wish I hadn't, she said. Not the loving him, but the not asking. I was so afraid of pushing him away that I left too much space. And he filled that space with silence. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Would you want to meet my mother? He asked. Eleanor looked up at him. At this man with her husband's eyes, this stranger who was not a stranger, this proof of a whole life that had existed before her own, running parallel, unacknowledged, underground. Yes, she said. I think I need to. They drove to Brookfield on a Sunday 2 weeks later, Eleanor and Pat together, following Daniel's Subaru north on I-94, while the bare Illinois fields gave way to bare Wisconsin fields, and the sky hung low and white and indifferent. Margaret Callahan, Margaret Reyes now, having taken her second husband's name, lived in a beige ranch house on a quiet residential street with 2 birch trees in the front yard and a wind chime by the front door that turned slowly in the November air. She was 71 years old, white-haired, compact, with the careful movements of someone who had learned long ago not to be surprised by anything. She opened the door before they reached the porch. Eleanor stopped on the front walk and looked at this woman, and this woman looked back at her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. Then Margaret said, "You look cold. Come inside." They sat in Margaret's kitchen over coffee and a plate of cookies that Margaret had clearly baked that morning. Eleanor noticed the order of the house, the photographs on the refrigerator, the stack of library books on the counter, the reading glasses folded on the table. She recognized in it the same steady, quiet competence she had always tried to maintain in her own life, the life of a woman who had held things together by herself for a very long time. "I don't blame you," Margaret said. It was the first real thing she had said, and she said it directly, looking straight at Eleanor. "In case you were wondering, you didn't know. He lied to you as thoroughly as he lied to everyone else." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I still felt... guilty?" Margaret's mouth made a dry, knowing shape. "I felt that too for a while. Like I must have done something to make him leave. Like there was something I missed, something I should have seen." She shook her head. "It wasn't us. It was him. He was a man who, when faced with an impossible choice, chose to save himself by disappearing. He dressed it up in noble reasons, protecting his family from threat, preventing himself from endangering us. And maybe some of that was true. But a braver man would have found another way. A braver man would have stayed." Eleanor was quiet, He was not a bad man, Margaret continued, with the exhausted fairness of a woman who had argued this out with herself many, many times. He did something good, going to the FBI. Those pension fund workers, real people, families, they got some justice because of him. That matters. But he made choices about how to handle the consequences that hurt people who didn't deserve to be hurt. That also matters. He left a note, Eleanor said, in the basement. For me, he wrote that the cowardice of good intentions is still cowardice. Margaret was still for a moment. Then she looked down at her coffee cup. Well, she said quietly. Good. He understood it then. At the end. They sat together for 3 hours. They talked about Richard and about Thomas and about the way a person can be both of those things at once. Real in one life, real in another, and somehow failing to be entirely real in either. They talked about their children. Margaret showed Eleanor photographs of Daniel as a boy. A gap-toothed kid with a bicycle, a serious teenager in a school play, a young man in a graduation gown. Eleanor thought about Diane and felt the familiar warmth of that love, and felt, beneath it, something new and complicated. The recognition that Richard's capacity for love had been real, and vast, and also profoundly, inexcusably compartmentalized. Before Eleanor left, Margaret walked her to the front door and stood with her on the porch for a moment, their breath visible in the cold air. What will you do now? Margaret asked. Eleanor looked at the birch trees, white and bare against the gray sky. I'm not sure, she said. I've spent 41 years being Richard Hayes's wife. I need to figure out who I am when I'm just Eleanor. Margaret considered this with the gravity it deserved. That's not a small thing, she said. No, Eleanor agreed. It isn't. December came to Chicago with its full force. The wind off Lake Michigan cutting down the streets like a blade, the sky low and pewter, the city pulling its collar up and pushing on. Eleanor had always loved Chicago winters, had always found something honest in their severity, the way they stripped things down and made the essential things visible. This year, she found that she loved it more than ever. She told Diane the week after she came back from Brookfield. She had planned the conversation carefully, had rehearsed it in her head during the drive back down I-94, had organized the documents in a folder on the kitchen table. But when Diane arrived and sat down and looked at her mother's face, she said immediately, Mom, what happened? And Eleanor, who had held herself together through the attorney's visit and the coffee shop meeting and the afternoon in Margaret's kitchen, looked at her daughter. This woman she had raised, this person made in part from the man she was now re-examining, and felt the full weight of it arrive at last. She cried for the first time, sitting at the kitchen table with her 42-year-old daughter's arms around her. He was someone else, she said between breaths. Before me, he was someone else entirely. Oh, Mom, Diane said. I don't know which man I loved, or if they were the same man, or if it matters. It matters, Diane said firmly, and you loved him. Whatever else is true, that was real. Your love was real. Don't let this take that from you. Eleanor looked at her daughter, at the steadiness in her face, the same steadiness Eleanor had spent a lifetime modeling, and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that was not quite peace, but was the shape of it, visible from a distance. Your grandfather, Eleanor said carefully. I mean, Daniel, you have a brother. Diane went very still. A half-brother, Eleanor clarified. He's in Kenosha. He teaches history. He seems like a good man. Diane processed this in silence for a long moment, her hands still wrapped around Eleanor's. Does he want to meet us? She asked finally. He does. He was very clear about that. Another long silence. The radiator ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the oak tree, bare now, skeletal, patient. Okay, Diane said. When you're ready. We'll do it. When you're ready. Eleanor met with a therapist in January, a woman named Dr. Adais Okonkwo, who worked out of an office on North Clark Street and had a direct, warm-hearted manner that Eleanor found immediately trustworthy. She had never been to therapy before. Richard had offered once, years ago after a difficult stretch, and she had said, I'm fine. I process things in my own way, and believed it. Now she recognized that statement for what it was, the posture of a woman who had learned to need as little as possible. I feel like I've been living inside someone else's story, she told Dr. Okonkwo in their third session, on a Tuesday afternoon while snow fell thickly outside. Like I was a character in a narrative that I thought was mine, but that someone else had authored. And what does it mean? Dr. Okonkwo asked. To author your own narrative? Eleanor thought about this for a long time. I'm not sure I've ever fully asked myself what I wanted, she said slowly. What I, Eleanor Morrison, not Eleanor Hayes, not Richard's wife or Diane's mother, what I actually want from the time I have left. What do you think you want? Dr. Okonkwo asked. The question sat there in the warm, quiet office, patient and enormous. I want to travel, Eleanor said, and was surprised to hear herself say it, surprised by how immediate it was, how certain, like something uncaged. I've always wanted to go to Portugal. Richard didn't like to travel. I let that be my limitation too. What else? I want to write. I kept a journal for 30 years and stopped when I retired because Richard thought it was indulgent. I want to write again. What else? Eleanor smiled, a small, surprised smile, the smile of someone finding a room they hadn't known was there. I want to get to know my daughter's children differently, not as a grandmother performing a role, as a person who is genuinely interested in who they are. That sounds, Dr. Okonkwo said, like a very full life. It does, Eleanor agreed. It does. She reached out to Daniel again in February. They had exchanged a few messages over the holidays. Careful, considerate messages. The messages of two people acknowledging a strange and significant connection without yet knowing what to make of it. In February, she called instead of writing, and they talked for an hour, and she told him about the therapy and the journal and the Portugal plan, and he laughed. A warm, genuine laugh that stopped her breath briefly, because it was so much like a laugh she had loved for 41 years and would never hear again. He laughed like that, she said, without thinking. I know, Daniel said. My mother always told me that was where I got it. A silence. Not uncomfortable. I want you to know, Eleanor said, that whatever you decide, about the money, about whether you want a relationship with Diane, about any of it, I'm not going to pressure you. You have your own life, your own history. You owe us nothing. I know, he said again. But I think... A pause, a gathering. I think I'd like to know Diane, if she's willing, and I think my daughters would like to meet their aunt. Your daughters, Eleanor said slowly, are my grandchildren's cousins. Yes, he said. I suppose they are. She sat with that for a moment, the strange, expanding mathematics of a secret revealed, the way a truth, once let in, reshapes the whole house it enters. Richard, she said quietly, whatever his failures, he loved you. In his inadequate, cowardly, compartmentalized way. That account he kept for 30 years was evidence of something. Of guilt, yes, of shame, but also, I think, of love. Daniel was quiet. I know, he said at last. I've thought about that. I've decided I can hold both things, the love and the abandonment. I don't have to choose one to make the other make sense. That, Eleanor said, is very wise. I teach history, he said dryly. It teaches you that most things are more than one thing at once. She laughed, and he laughed, and outside the snow fell on North Paulina Street, and the oak tree stood bare and patient in the backyard, waiting for spring. She booked Portugal for September. She told Pat over dinner at their favorite Italian place on Armitage Avenue, the one they'd been going to since 1997, with the checkered tablecloths and the owner who always remembered their usual order. Pat looked at her across the table and said, I'm coming with you. And Eleanor said, I was hoping you'd say that. She started writing again in March. Not a journal exactly. Something longer, something more deliberate. She sat at the kitchen table on weekend mornings with her coffee and the light coming through the window, and she wrote about Richard, about Thomas, about Margaret and Daniel, about the 41 years and what they meant now that she understood them differently. She wrote about the oak tree in the backyard, and about the 4th grade classroom where she had spent 32 years teaching children how to read and think and believe that the world was comprehensible. She wrote about the woman she had been inside the marriage, and the woman who was emerging outside of it. She was not angry, not exactly. She was something more complex than anger, something she didn't yet have a name for. She was a woman in her 70s who had discovered that the ground she'd built her life on had a false floor, and who was now, carefully, deliberately, learning the difference between what had been real and what had been constructed. The love had been real. The family had been real. Diane was real. The grandchildren were real. 32 years of fourth graders were real. Pat was real. This kitchen table and the chamomile tea and the oak tree and the city she had lived in and loved for 40 years, all of it was real. Richard's lies did not unmake her life. They explained certain silences, certain shadows, but they did not reach forward and undo what she had made. She understood that now. On a Sunday in April, when the oak tree was just beginning to green at the tips of its branches, Eleanor hosted a Sunday lunch at the house on North Paulina Street. Diane was there, and her husband Marco, and the grandchildren. Pat came, and Pat's son and his wife. And for the first time, Daniel came, with Carol and their daughters. 2 teenagers named Sophie and Grace, who were shy at first, and then within an hour, were in the backyard with the grandchildren, throwing a frisbee under the regreening oak tree. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, the same window where 7 months ago she had watched the leaves fall and held a cold cup of tea and not yet known what was coming. And she watched them all. She thought about Thomas Callahan, who had become Richard Hayes, who had been, in his complicated and insufficient way, trying to be good. She thought about what Dr. Okonkwo had said in their last session. You can mourn the marriage you thought you had and still honor the one you actually had. Both things can be true. Diane appeared at her elbow with a dish towel over her shoulder. You okay? She asked. Yes, Eleanor said. And she meant it. Not as the reflexive answer she had given for decades to that question, the trained I'm fine of a woman who had learned to compress herself. She meant it genuinely, with full knowledge of what it cost and what it contained. He should have told you, Diane said. Yes, Eleanor agreed. He should have, but he didn't, and I'm still here. She looked out at the yard, at Sophie and Grace and the grandchildren, at the oak tree holding its new leaves up to the April light. I've decided something, she said. What? Diane asked. I've decided that the last of my life is going to be written by me, not by who I was to him or to anyone else. By me. Diane leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. It's going to be a good, she said. Eleanor put her arm around her daughter and looked out at the yard, at the light, at the tree that was here and would be here long after all of them were gone, rooted in soil that contained everything, all the seasons, all the truths, all the imperfect, irreplaceable people who had stood beneath it. Yes, she said. It is.